The filed report sat on the flagship's encryption desk, its header blinking with a priority clearance that usually signaled a solar flare or a planetary coup. For admirals had already accessed the file within 6 minutes of its submission. I watched the read receipts populate on my interface, each one a silent admission that the math governing our current interstellar strategy had just been deleted. You'll want to hear why. The part that keeps me awake is knowing that our entire tactical manual was undone by a conversation about water. 11 standard days earlier, the flagship bridge was holding a steady cognitive prime temperature of 4.2 degrees Celsius. I stood at the tactical center, my primary heart beating a slow, efficient rhythm against the frost-rimed consoles. 60 RT officers worked in a silence so thick it was almost physical, their breath forming faint, crystalline plumes in the air. Then the human exchange officer arrived, moving through the airlock with a heavy, grounded step that seemed to ignore the slickness of the deck, which meant the internal sensors were calibrated correctly. Darcy Voss didn't shiver. Her skin was a vibrant, alarming shade of flush, radiating a thermal bloom that the bridge cameras highlighted in sharp oranges and reds. She looked like a biological furnace walking into a meat locker. When she reached my station, she extended a hand, her movement deliberate and stripped of military flourish. I accepted the gesture. Her grip was firm, dry, and impossibly warm. I logged the contact as a baseline cultural greeting, noting the compressive force felt like being caught in a docking clamp. She didn't look at the tactical holograms. Instead, she leaned against a structural safety railing, testing the weight of her own frame against the metal. "It's a bit crisp in here," Darcy said, her voice carrying the quiet resonance of someone used to shouting over the roar of a furnace. I checked my readout. Optimal for processing, Exchange Officer Voss. "Are your thermal stabilizers malfunctioning?" She let out a short, dry huff of air and gripped the railing tighter to shift her weight. An amber warning flashed on my peripheral display. The pressure sensor in the alloy bar was registering 400 newtons of force, a load typically reserved for structural bracing during high-G maneuvers. Darcy didn't seem to notice the alarm. She was looking at the ventilation grates, her eyes narrowed in professional interest. "Not malfunctioning," she said, her fingers tracing a seam in the metal. "I'm a glassblower back in Murano. I've spent my life standing in front of kills at 1100 degrees. This actually feels like a spring morning." The statement was absurd. No biological entity in the known sectors functioned at those temperatures without a pressurized hardsuit. I began a background probability model, my talons clicking rhythmically against my thigh. I assumed she was exaggerating, a common human trait used to mask environmental distress. "A spring morning on a cryo world, perhaps," I countered. Darcy tilted her head, a stray lock of hair falling over her eyes. "On Earth, in the heat, we sweat. Everywhere. Up to 2 liters an hour." She said it with the casual flatness of someone reporting the weather. My click count stopped instantly. I looked at her, truly looked at her, ignoring the thermal bloom to focus on the pores of her skin. The cooling efficiency required to dump that much internal heat through liquid evaporation suggested a radiator system of terrifying proportions. My adjutant shifted behind me, his scales clinking. Darcy just stood there, her hands resting on a railing she was technically deforming, waiting for me to process the math. The clicking of my talons accelerated into a rhythmic staccato against the console. I opened a high-fidelity probability map, feeding the 2-liter metric into our standard attrition models for the Arrakis Prime engagement. Darcy hummed a low, tuneless melody under her breath as she waited. She reached out and absent-mindedly smoothed a smudge of condensation from the local area sensor map, her fingertip leaving a faint, warm smear on the holographic glass. The simulation results cascaded across my vision in a flood of catastrophic red. Our entire doctrine for the scorch sector relied on heat-based deterrence, assuming a biological limit for infantry that the humans simply ignored. We had spent cycles perfecting weapons that attacked the lungs and the nervous system, but we had never encountered a species that used its entire skin as a radiator to bypass the thermodynamic wall. If a battalion of glassblowers landed on a sun-bleached moon, they wouldn't need to find cover. They would simply walk through the noonday glare until our defensive lines collapsed from heatstroke. The Third Fleet was obsolete. Humans possess 2 to 4 million eccrine sweat glands spread across a nearly hairless epidermis. This is not merely a cooling system. It is an engine of attrition. While other known species rely on respiratory panting or shaded inactivity to survive solar peaks, the human chassis uses full-body evaporative cooling to maintain a stable core temperature during extreme exertion. They are persistence predators who evolved to walk their prey into heart failure under a meridian sun. Back in the command sanctum, the report's confirmation chime felt like a funeral bell. I watched Admiral Vrel, a veteran of 40 lunar sieges, stare at the physical readout of the pressure sensor log. Vrel's upper mandible twitched, a habit he usually reserved for planetary bombardments, as he cross-referenced the 400 newtons of force with Darcy's resting heartbeat. To us, that grip was the strength of a hydraulic press. To her, it was just how one held a railing while thinking about the weather. Junior analyst Kalen, only 19 cycles into his commission, stood at the neighboring station. He stared at his display as the fleet's tactical difficulty rating for the Humanarchy border shifted from stable to extreme. Kalen's secondary eyelids began to flutter in a rapid, involuntary tick, his hands trembling as he reached for a hydration cylinder. I looked back at Darcy. She was watching the stars, her breathing steady and her posture relaxed in the 4.2-degree air. I adjusted the security classification of her file, moving it from cultural exchange to intelligence critical. The initial handshake hadn't been a greeting. It was a warning of the crushing density required to survive a world that stayed at 1100 degrees. The amber sensor light on the railing continued to pulse. Yevrin rested his hand on the cold alloy, feeling the microscopic depression Darcy's thumb had left in the metal. The tactical bridge remained at 4.2 degrees. Outside, the silent white curve of a nearby moon reflected in the viewport glass. A single data file icon flickered green on the master console. The cooling fans of the flagship hummed in the dark.